So we're a couple minutes out, right? So I think we're going to want to tee up our next person. I'll let you do that, sir. And we're going to bring in Kirsten, I believe.
Yep. So is she standing by? You're pretty close to. Let me tell you a little something about this this woman. Kirsten Bartok Touw is Air Finance's founder and managing partner. There she is. Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning, you. How are you?
With that wonderful smile on a Wednesday. We need that here in the middle of the week. Great to see you. Let me tell you, let me tell our friends out here that are listening, Kirsten, a little about you. This company, Air Finances, is well, it specializes in structured finance, leasing, and the financing of aircraft, and with an emphasis on emerging markets. Air Finance's core business is as an originator and servicer of aviation loans, and its fleet of financed aircraft ranges from Cessna Caravans to Gulfstream G650s. Boy, that's going from one end to the other. That's fantastic. Prior to Air Finance, she was Vice President, Strategy, Structured Finance, and Corporate Development at Hawker Beechcraft Corporation, HBC. Kirsten has been actively involved in many air mobility efforts in various different companies and organizations, and she has also spent many, many years in private equity, venture capital, investment banking, capital markets, and in mergers and acquisitions. To say she's a rather intelligent young lady and most busy as well. Hello, my friend. Well done. Oh my gosh, I'm very impressed with your bio.
Thanks so much. We've
been. Do you have a highlight of all those things you've done? What's the highlight?
I connect aerospace and finance, so that's my specialty, and we've been the last 4 years focused on advanced air mobility. So I'm excited to moderate this panel here today. And lastly, we have a SPAC focused on next gen defense and advanced air mobility. So to add to that, we are busy, and I'm honored to be participating in this panel with both David and Robin and help moderate the conversation. So it's going to be a good one.
Well, Kirsten, we're delighted to have you here. I'll turn it over to you and David, and thank you again for being here. Delighted to have you.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it. Well, I am lucky enough to be here with two very esteemed panelists today who are experts in the advanced air mobility sector, as well as the how it impacts America's security and their future. And we've got a very interesting conversation. So I'm going to let each of them, I'm going to give a start so quickly. Both of them have more distinguished careers than I do. Robin is the practice leader of global aerospace and defense at Deloitte, and he can give you a minute or two more what he does. And then David spent a career at Boeing and now is at the Aerospace Industries Association, where he is vice president for civil aviation, and both of them are at the intersection. So what I'd like to do is give them a quick kind of 1 minute on where they are focused on this and what their thoughts are. Robin is a thought leader as well. He recently published a very important piece on the sector. And then we're going to dive in and have some conversations about what's going on and how it relates to America's security. So Robin, would it be okay if you start this morning with a brief bio, and then we'll go to David?
Sure. Thank you, Kirsten. Good morning, David. Thank you for having me. Let's see, I'm a prior Air Force officer, helped manage the software development quality assurance for the AWACS, which gave me a little insight into how air traffic automation works. Very similar model there. And I've been with Deloitte or its predecessors for 35 years. I'm finishing my career as the outgoing lead for aerospace and defense globally, as you mentioned, for Deloitte. And over the past 3 years, I've been writing and researching and writing extensively on what we once called urban air mobility or flying cars, all those crazy terms that we've settled into advanced air mobility to do that. And so, and the segue here to David is David and I co-authored a recent paper on advanced air mobility and what it means to the United States, and really setting forth a strategy to do that. David and I have collaborated for a couple of years and thought it'd be a nice piece to do given the timing of the market. So,
an important one to our country and our industry. So thank you both.
Hi, thanks, Robin. Thanks, Kirsten. So former Army officer myself, so the power of purple coming together between the Air Force and the Army, working together with Robin on this. As Kirsten mentioned, I'm a former Boeing engineer and leader, and more recently, I've been working at Aerospace Industries Association. We represent over 300 member companies in the aerospace and defense industry here in Washington, D.C. focused on ensuring that the regulatory and the U.S. Legislative policies are focused on ultimately the U.S. success in a very, very global economy, and trying to put in place the principles that will continue that U.S. leadership. So very simple work on the face of it.
Great. Well, I'm going to start the conversation, and then I'll kind of lead my two experts here. So we have about 550 people on listening to you. Can you give just a 2-second on advanced air mobility, what it is and why it's important to America's security? Let one of you choose who's going to lead off. So,
sure, I'll start and maybe what it is, and let David talk a little bit about why it's important. So, David and I talked a lot about this when writing the paper, and so one is we've taken the position that it's not a single point in time, but rather than a longer arc of the integration of advanced technologies into either our airspace or onto our aircraft that will allow us to develop new products and new services over a longer term, while we've stopped and taken a view of the vertical takeoff and landing vehicles that are currently hybrid electric kind of as a point in time. We think that advanced air mobility would include other things such as supersonics, hypersonics, those sorts of things. But given where we were in the timing, we thought focused on advanced translating advanced air mobility into the lens through the urban air mobility, both passenger and cargo, would be the right thing to do at this time.
And within air mobility, do you also include drones and autonomy and the type of AI and data analytics which we're seeing, or is that?
Yes, we include that as all part elements that are enablers for this technology. We know we're seeing this convergence at this time, that any one of those would not result in the kind of rapid change we're seeing in the eVTOL market and those. But with those coming together, it's a unique time that as we bring those together and integrate them, it offers us the opportunity for this new mode of transportation.
Okay. David, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to add. I think there's a risk if you, Kirsten, if you don't include those types of other technologies when we're talking about AAM, because the key to this ultimately is the integration of the air traffic system, and all of these future or current technologies from AAM, UAM, to drones, to supersonic, they're all going to be sharing the space with today's GA and today's commercial aviation. And so we risk, by not treating them all in terms of one policy, one set of integrated technologies, we risk bifurcating the system and therefore ending up with a sub-optimized airspace.
Totally agree. And so I always like to think about it's the enabling technologies, it's the advanced technologies that are being incorporated into aerospace and defense. But we also have to think about it as the infrastructure too, that it's going to ride upon. So I absolutely agree with you both. So why is this so important to America's future and America's security? Tell us that.
So I'll start off with the America's future, and I'll use the past performances as our indicator, but not necessarily a future success. First of all, you got to know that this is very serious in that people are taking it seriously. A lot of people will look back at the past and look at the very light jet period that we went through and said, is this another one of those? Is this another BLJ? Well, we've got over $2 billion worth of capital already invested by the end of 2019. We don't have last year's figures, and these are according to NASA. So people are putting the money in because they think there's going to be money coming out. Looking at past history, if I look at the totality of the U.S. aerospace system, we have 10 million U.S. workers involved in that, with a 1.5 trillion in economic activity in 2019, so prior to the pandemic. For aviation, manufacturing ourselves, currently just on the civil side, there's over 600,000 U.S. jobs associated with that. And with a $390 billion in U.S. economic output as part of commercial airspace, there's a very, very big prize that's out there for the U.S. to either win or not win. And it's going to be decided in the next couple of years. I'll toss it over to Robin to kind of add.
Yeah, that's perfect. Absolutely, David. So, at the very high level, there's fundamentally two reasons we need to address this, and as David said, win on this. The first is to enjoy the economic benefits that this new market, both for domestic and export, will afford us. And we've taken a hard look at these numbers, and by 2035, we believe that the market space for that will be 115 billion. You put that in context, that's 30% the size of the number that David talked about of our current aerospace and defense commercial marketplace. So we could grow the business, holding our current business steady by 30% over that time. That's a half a point on GDP. That's 280,000 high-paying jobs, of which a good portion serves the domestic market and about 50K of those serving the global market. So, that could represent an increment of about 8% on our workforce. So huge economic benefit if we seize and lead on that market. Then secondly is, and this I think is the national security public safety implication of that. If you think about the vehicles themselves and their dual use capability, having a reliable, secure domestic source of those vehicles to serve both the military as well as the as our civil safety, whether it be search and rescue, those sorts of things that the civil authorities can utilize the vehicles for, is very important. It's not only the vehicles, but the air traffic management systems that we think about putting in place, having a secure, reliable domestic source of the software that's going to control these vehicles over our head at like 400 to 500 feet. It's really important for us to do that. And if we can seize that market early, then we can drive global adoption policy, create the export market, and really be, and again, enjoy those economic as well as national security benefits, somewhat like perhaps you've heard the term first mover, right? If we can take the first mover advantage, we can have a big impact on the global market and our national and economic security.
How has, and I'm in complete agreement with you guys, how has what has happened with the U.S. Industries in both the chip sector, us losing our advantage and control over that supply chain, as well as 5G? It seemed like we were focused on greater technologies, other technologies, the battery industry, and now we have China with the lead in those sectors. Has that really informed why you're taking a forward-leaning, proactive approach in this space?
David?
Yeah, so absolutely. I think that we, by not having a national strategy to win, we are ultimately setting ourselves up for failure. We have taken, we've traditionally taken a very laissez-faire attitude towards business, which has been appropriate, I think, in the past economy. But increasingly, we're seeing that in the future, we're going to have to adapt to the current situations and the advantages that others have. I'll give you an example. In China, where you have a state-run industry, they have an advantage in that they can, for an AAM, they can set up the parameters for testing and ultimately the commercial use of those aircraft. That's a very big deal compared to what we can accomplish in the U.S., right? Where we have, yes, we have one singular FAA, which is great, but we also have state and local legislators, which are quite appropriately powerful in what they can do and what they can control. And if we are not working with them at a national level, we are giving up any advantages that we may have in this area.
Really great. And you're at the intersection of kind of government and business. Historically, we've taken that laissez-faire approach and we've lost some industries. We've lost Cirrus to the Chinese. We've lost Continental to the Chinese. There are more risks. What can the U.S. do? And David, both of you are at the center of this because Robin, you ran the government practice as well. What can the U.S. do to make sure that we don't lose our leadership here in this sector?
Yeah. I think there's two broad areas. I'll let David speak to one because he's much more around on the policy side. The other part is, the investment, right, is supporting in various ways the investment in the technologies. Some you literally mentioned, like battery technology and others, so that we can develop the IP and the domestic sources for those. And secondly is how we look at it. And we're a really unique time now. And if hopefully someone's picking this up, in the current infrastructure discussions, if we could look at investments or methods by which we could build out the physical infrastructure, to your point earlier, Kirsten, we got to take off and land these things somewhere. So how do we stimulate the infrastructure developments to stimulate the technology environment, and then put some policy around how we protect at a national level, and I'll say yes, protect that IP and that lead for the domestic, so that we don't end up decade from now looking back saying, boy, wouldn't it have been nice if we'd have kept, substitute, fill in the blank, that technology now, because it's a driver for the global leadership. David, I didn't want to touch the broad policy stuff, because that's really, you know much more about that than I do.
Yeah, so for U.S. leadership in this area, I see it as three areas, which is establishing demand, fulfilling that demand, and then being prepared ultimately to export it, this technology. And when I talk about establishing demand, I'm not talking about the consumer, you know, us putting in place something that makes the consumer buy it. What I'm talking about is realizing the policies and regulations necessary to create the environment that market forces will then drive people to want to purchase this, right? So how do we go ahead of, so it really comes down to how do we establish that demand from a partnership between industry and government. And even within that, you're staying by my rules of threes, right? You have public-to-public partnerships, you have public-to-private partnerships, and then you have private-to-private. Okay, in public-to-public, very important, and they're already engaged, but we need to continue to push and drive NASA, the U.S. military, and the DOT with the FAA to continue to focus on this area. Now, there are great programs out there like Agility Prime on the military side that are helping us push that envelope. But continuing to invest in these types of public-to-public type programs is going to be key for us to understand the ultimate military use, the civilian use, and then the integration into our airspace. Then we also need, on the public-to-public, quite honestly, we need a lot of engagement between the DOT, FAA, and the state and local. Because as a good friend of mine from the city of LA once said, you know, the FAA can tell you where these vehicles can fly, but it's up to them to tell them where they can land and take off from. So if we don't have their cooperation and their full buy-in, we're in trouble for the future. And then ultimately, what do we need? Other things is we need to understand what infrastructure is required. And I'm not saying these are not shovel-ready projects today, but we need to understand what we need to invest in from the infrastructure, whether it's a vertiport or whether it's an electrical grid, right? And keeping in mind that our electrical grid is going to have increased demand on it, not just from these types of aircraft, but also from the electrification of cars and autos, right? And then finally, the FAA, we need to certify, we need to help us integrate, we need to standardize that integration across the whole AAM spectrum, and then we need to improve the system because it needs to become a learning system as we continue to.
I'm in complete agreement, David. And I'm going to push you a little bit further on this because I think it's a time for novel thinking. And I'm going to give it, you know, if you think good taxpayer dollars are spent well, watch what PK is doing at NASA and what Jaewon Shin put in place. I mean, I have never seen, they really stepped in and filled the void in this industry, showed a roadmap of how we get there. And I mean, it made me so proud as both American citizen and someone leading the industry. And if you look at AFWorks and what Diller did and Roper did and the whole team with AFWorks and Agility Prime, that was novel thinking. We need that type of thinking adopted by the rest of the DoD to approach all of these technologies. What are some other areas in which, because I worry that if we're stuck in our traditional private-public partnership, kind of traditional regulatory thinking, we're going to find ourselves flat-footed going forward. And we're going to find ourselves with the problem of not investing in the strategic areas that we need to. So all those guys I applaud. I just say we need more of it. What are some examples of where you're pushing, where you can see more of kind of that coordination where, again, is DOD and sort of the Air Force and what Lieutenant Diller's doing is providing the fertilizer for the industry. They're not doing it for them, but they're providing the fertilizer and they're watering it. What are some other examples?
Yeah, I'm going to step one step off from the actual vehicle itself, and
right.
to make an observation here is, so our aircraft industry in the past, if you compare production rates at automotive and aircraft historically, we need our aerospace market to be prepared to, and we're just using the terms, at near automotive rates. So I think there's a process, a technology, machinery, if you will, thinking about how to service the ultimate demand domestically with new production techniques, with new thinking about process. You mentioned PK and those folks, they're certainly doing a lot of work at getting the supply chain put together, but the people that are in that supply chain have to be thinking about different rates of production, supply chain resiliency, those sorts of things. So we get a lot of people asking and focusing about what we need to do on the vehicle. And that problem is becoming pretty well understood, composites, engines, battery density, detect and avoid, autonomy, AI, those sorts of things. And I think we've got a pretty good idea around there, but because of that focus on the sexiness of the vehicle, we may not be focused on the enablers to get to the production rates necessary to meet the ultimate demand.
Robin, I'm going to push you on this because I think it's a great point. And I've spoken at a couple of panels and give talks on. I am worried about the aerospace industry. I think they are old school. Some of them live in a duopoly. The other business jet guys are focused on their space, and they're not leaning in enough to the exact point you said. You've got Toyota who's investing in the sector. You've got Daimler who's investing in the sector. You've got Hyundai who's investing in the sector. And we see, Bell has done an incredible job, but they're just kind of playing around in it. They're not really going for certification. So to your point, it looks to me like that if these aerospace companies, our crown jewels, don't lean in a bit further, that they're going to, again, be caught flat-footed, and they're going to lose to the automotive guys who know how to do high unit and volume numbers, which is what we expect in this sector. So how would you respond to that?
I agree. In fact, I'm on record 2 or 3 years ago writing that the automotive industry has the production and the rate and supply chain velocity advantage, but lacks experience of getting aircraft built and certified under the regulations. The other side is the advantage the aerospace firms have is they know that, but they are steeped in bespoke manufacturing techniques. And so, it was those who can fill that gap or partner perhaps together in a way that brings those two great strengths together for the U.S. advantage.
Yeah, I'd like to add, so first of all, PK and I are on speed dial to each other, and we talk about the supply chain a lot and the needs therein. And I think that's a place where we need to invest. I think the other part of it is we've got two, as Robin pointed out just now, we have two areas that are colliding with each other. One is in aerospace, our understanding of safety and 10 to the minus 9th, 10 to the minus 5th type reliability and safety is going to be anything other than that is a non-starter when you start putting anything up into the air. So these products at that supply chain scale are going to have to be produced at the same reliability and safety ratings as current aircraft. I think where the automotive industry is starting to understand that is in the recent Tesla accidents and then the other accidents that have occurred, because they are experiencing what I would call the aviation effect, where a single event, which is tragic, gets a lot of press. Whereas, you have something like, hundreds, tens of thousands of people who die on the highways, unfortunately, every year, don't normally show up in the newspaper, right? So automation changes everything in this area, because once you have people take their hands off, like in an airplane, you're not flying the airplane. In these vehicles, you're not driving that car. Things become very, very different. So understanding that safety piece is going to be a key piece of whoever wins in this area. To your other point about the conservatism of U.S. Manufacturing, aerospace, I think by nature we have become conservative. But I think back to the days of the heady days of the Apollo missions, which I was not alive for, or was briefly just born. The goal there was, look how we got behind that, and we weren't afraid to fail. And I think back to the Mercury rockets and seeing all those films of the unfortunate but spectacular explosions on the pad, right? Those were public, right? Because we weren't afraid to fail. And we've got to take that same attitude about investing in these types of programs in the future, while still, when we finally put people in these aircraft, they're going to have to be safe and reliable.
David, I mean, both of you, we're all on the same page. I believe everything you guys have said. So how do we do that? So we've got a bunch of OEMs who have their business. It's been a tough year with COVID. They've got to meet their projections. They're public companies. And we've got all these startups out there. And I've heard recently that our aerospace companies are losing most of their, if their biggest competitor right day for talent is these startups. And your constituency group is traditional aerospace groups. How can the US, do we need something like a sovereign fund in the US to invest in these technologies? Because typically traditional investors don't love deep tech. They don't love highly regulated industries, and they don't like things that have a very long timeline. So how do we as an industry think differently about investing in this sector?
Yeah,
go ahead, Robin, let you start.
Well, I actually think there's quite a bit of money out there. I think what we need to do is drive demand. I appreciate, you're a professional in this with respect to where investors like to spend their money, but I look back over the last 6-8 months and the money put into, you mentioned your SPAC, there are others, and taking significant positions in the companies. It looks like we're going to cross the chasm we're going to get. There's now some money to get to there. I think very rapidly, we've got to get to the demand side of this. And I think, that the kind of things like AFWorks and those things demonstrating, because I do believe that the first viable demonstration of these products is going to be the military environment, because we can, to some degree, abate some of the regulatory activity and get these vehicles up running and get a lot of lessons learned through military use, because we're not flying them over civil areas. Right? So I think there's some of that. But I actually believe it's drive the demand side, show there's a market, and we can get there. And well, I'll pause for a moment, turn it over to David. I'd like to come back to talk and revisit something David talked about is state and local in the local areas. I think, that is a piece. But David, your view on this?
Yeah, I'm going to fall back on my military background here. And I'm going to say, I don't know about as much about capital as you do, Kirsten. But ultimately, I'll agree with Robin that, the money's there. So what kind of effort is needed to get us there? And I think back to from a US government kind of standpoint, and where I go back to my military is back in OIF2 when I was serving overseas, right? We moved into a rapid prototyping and get things to the troops, right? And that's the kind of mentality we need to win in this area. We need to figure out how our government can get past their standard old barriers of way of doing things and rapidly prototype within airspace safely to certify these vehicles safely so that we can get these vehicles out there and operating in initially confined environments, right? To ultimately to widespread use. Because that's what takes you from where we were welding metal onto our Humvees, okay, to where we had up-armored Humvees. That's how you get there. And so we have to take that same mentality to ultimately be successful.
Robin, you had a point that you wanted to make, so I'll let you go.
Yeah, I said it a little earlier, and I'll repeat it and put it in context, is we need to be the first to our own market. We need to develop and be the first to our own market. And the infrastructure that we briefly talked about before, working with the state and local, educating local authorities, helping them through the process of establishing concepts of operations of how they will work with and deal with these both drone size up to cargo and human sized vehicles in and around the major metropolitan, urban and suburban areas. I think is key, because we can develop the technology. The more rapidly we develop the technology without getting the permission and the physical infrastructure, the more risk we run at being outpaced by our near-peer competitors. And so right now, there are several countries, Germany, Korea, particularly China, that are working very heavily in order to get the product out in their own market. And my concern is, as I suspect many is China, because of their government structure, vis-a-vis there, it can be much more directive, is what David was, I think, implying, I'll put words in his mouth, is they can steer the ship more rapidly because they can. And they have the tech base. So my concern is that they're able to move through the infrastructure and permissibility issues faster than we are, and their market starts developing and they serve it themselves. So I think, again, speaking back to the investment right now, if I focused on one thing, it would be getting some major metropolitan areas sorted out as to how they're going to utilize these and get deployed.
And Robin, on that note, who are those people coordinating with those? Because I don't necessarily see the FAA doing that. PK's got a lot on his plate at NASA, so I've watched it kind of be, there's an industry consortium and there's individual companies, but to your point, without a coordinated effort, without real leaning in, that pull from the consumer side when these get certified, and this unfortunately has to be our last question, does seem is a problem. So who are you seeing leaning in? Who needs to be coordinate that?
Right now, we're seeing, let's like a better word, called the advocates trying to coordinate. I can compliment AIA. They're working with the U.S. Council of Mayors, being led by, I think, the mayor in Colorado Springs or Denver.
Yeah, Mayor Hancock. Yes.
Yeah, leading that. So we've done the briefings. We've been to two, let's call it 101 sessions to educate what they are. But that's not enough. I do think that the national government needs to coordinate an outreach program from one of the relevant departments to start educating and providing support to do that. And that would be another place, you talked about a sovereign fund. I'm not sure the exact structure, but the ability to help co-invest in the infrastructure to take the dollar barriers out of the way to get the first wave of infrastructure in place would be a huge help.
Well, I think that's a great way to end our panel. So I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with the two of you. I look forward to following up and helping move this forward. And I encourage everyone to think heavily about how we need to have public-private partnerships to make sure we stay strong in this industry. So thank you both. I appreciate you being here today.
Thank you. Thanks, David.
And let me also say, Robin and David, outstanding. It was a great trifecta. All three of you were just outstanding. What a way to kick it off. Day 2 of our Defense Innovation Summit here in the America's Future Series. Thank you so much, David and Robin. And Kirsten, you too were just wonderful as the moderator. So thanks to all three of you. That was wonderful. You always wonder when you kick something off, it's a brand new day. You really wanted to have some stuffing to it, and they all three of them were just wonderful. So thank you again to Kirsten, David, and Robin.